So hello, good morning, and today we're going to be having tea with the worst granny in the world. So this is page 39 in your book, so you can follow along with me or you can just sit and listen. Once you have read this or once you've listened to it, I'd like you please to write a diary entry imagining that you are Joe. So I want loads and loads of feelings. How are you feeling when you first step through the door? How do you feel when you see the terrible things on the table? And how do you feel at the end? So lots of description of how you feel, description of what you see, how is Granny behaving, what are your feelings towards her. Okay, so read this through or listen to me read it very carefully, and then your diary entry. Your diary entry doesn't have to be very long, a page maximum, half a page maybe. I just want lots of feelings and adjectives. Okay, and you can always draw a picture of the table at the end if you want, or the whole scene with the cactus. It's up to you. So, tea with Granny. A few weeks later, Granny invited Joe to tea. She always used to do this towards the end of the holidays, but curiously, neither Mr. nor Mrs. Warden were ever available. Mr. Warden was at work, and Mrs. Warden, who was now having lessons in Chinese cookery, was at work. And so Mrs. Jinks was the only one left to take him. Up until now, Joe would have quite looked forward to seeing his granny, but not anymore. He knew now, and even the thought of her filled him with dread. "I don't want to go," he told Mrs. Jinks as she got into the car. "Why ever not, Jordan? You know how your granny looks forward to seeing you." Yes, like a fox looks forward to seeing chickens, Joe thought. "I don't like her," he said. "That's a cruel thing to say." "Well, I think she's cruel." "Now that's quite enough of that," Mrs. Jinks sniffed. "I suppose you're still thinking about that silly Christmas present. It was a misunderstanding, that's all." Joe had set fire to the misunderstanding. He'd taken the toy robot to the bottom of the garden and poured lighter fuel over it, and then put a match to it. He and old Mr. Lampy had watched it as it melted, the plastic bubbling and blistering and the colours running into each other, so that for a moment it did look like some alien creature before it shrivelled into a black, sticky puddle. The old gardener has shaken his head. "You shouldn't ought to have done that, Master Warden." "Why not?" "Should have gone to a charity shop or a hospital. I'm sure there was someone somewhere who'd wanted it." And Joe had felt a twinge of guilt, but it was too late. The robot was gone. Granny lived in a flat in a tall modern block called Wisteria Lodge. This was what the estate agents would have called a purpose-built block, although they might not be able to say what the purpose actually was. Perhaps it was simply to hold grannies, as hardly anyone in the building was under 70 years of age. Everything in Wisteria Lodge happened in slow motion. The lift had been specially adapted to go so slowly you couldn't feel it moving. On one occasion it broke down, and Mr. and Mrs. Warden stood in it for 3/4 of an hour before they realised what had happened. Granny's flat was on the 6th floor, with views over a small field and the traffic of the North Circular Road. Once she had lived in a comfortable house in a tree-lined avenue, but when that had got too much for her to handle, her daughter had moved her here. It was actually a very pleasant flat, with silk curtains, thick carpets, antique furniture and chandeliers. But if you asked her about it, Granny would shrug and sigh. "Well, I have to put up with it. I don't have a choice, do I? Oh dear, I don't know." And she would look so sorry for herself that you would forget that there were thousands of old people in far smaller places with no heating and no real comfort who would have given their right arm to live here. "Hello, Jack. How lovely to see you. Come in, make yourself comfortable." Waves of pure heat shimmered in the air as Jordan stepped unwillingly into the flat, Mrs. Jinks gently pushing him from behind. The central heating was on full all the time. Granny had once been given a 6-inch cactus by Mr. Warden after a business trip to the Sahara, and obviously the intense heat suited it, for it was now over 11 feet high, dominating the room, with brilliant flowers and vicious spikes. "Come in, Mrs. Jinx, what an unusual hat. I'm not wearing a hat, Mrs. Kettle. Then if I were you, I'd change my hairdresser. Granny moved forward and stooped over Jordan. So how are you, my dear? She reached out a gnarled finger and prodded his cheek. Healthy skin, healthy colour, full of vitamins? She winked at Mrs. Jinx. He gets plenty of vitamins, Mrs. Jinx replied. Granny's comment about the hat had annoyed her, Joe could see. And how about his enzymes? Granny asked. His what? Mrs. Jinx inquired. His enzymes. Has he got healthy enzymes? What about his cytoplasm? Mrs. Jinx shook her head. I'm sorry, Mrs. Kettle, she said. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, come in, Granny snarled briefly and jerked a finger into the room. The table had already been laid for tea, and Joe sat down with Mrs. Jinx next to him. Briefly, he scanned the food that lay before him. There it was, the same as always. It was incredible. How could a tea possibly be so vile? First, there were egg mayonnaise sandwiches, but the eggs had been left out for so long the yellows had taken on a greenish tint. They had so much salt on them they made your eyes water. Then there was herring on a plate, raw and slippery and soused in some sort of particularly sharp vinegar. Granny's homemade cakes were dry and heavy, guaranteed to glue the top of your mouth to the bottom of your mouth with little taste in between. Even the biscuits were horrible, round, colourless things with neither chocolate nor cream, but decorated with almond flakes and bits of desiccated cherry that got caught in your teeth. But by far the worst item on the table was Granny's cream cheese special. Joe caught sight of it and felt his mouth water unpleasantly and his stomach shrivel as if trying to find somewhere to hide. Granny's cream cheese special consisted of just one thing: cream cheese. That was all it was. A big bowl of cream cheese, and he knew he would be expected to eat it all. And he couldn't refuse it. That was the worst of it. It was part of his upbringing. Mr. Warden insisted that children shouldn't be allowed to leave the table until they had finished everything that they'd been given. After all, food costs money, and the money was his. As a child, Mr. Warden had once remained at the table for an astonishing 46 hours before he had finally given in and agreed to eat a plate of bread and butter pudding that his father had given him. The fact of the matter is that the worst thing about parents is often their parents. That's certainly where they get most of their rotten ideas. Just get some serviettes. Granny hobbled off into the kitchen and Joe quickly turned to Mrs. Jinx. I can't eat this, he said. Of course you can, Mrs. Jinx replied, but she didn't sound convinced. No, can't you see? She's done it on purpose. She's chosen all the things I can't stand and she's put them here because she knows you'll make me eat them. She's torturing me. Joe, you're going to get a big smack if you go on like this. Why won't you believe me? The whole conversation had taken place in whispers, but these last words rasped in his throat. She hates me. She loves you. She's your granny. Then Granny returned from the kitchen, carrying some faded paper serviettes. Not started yet, she croaked, grinning at Joe. She put the serviettes down and picked up a green porcelain bowl filled to the brim with thick cream cheese. Then she forked out a raw herring and laid it on top. That'll give it extra taste, she cackled. Finally, she slid the whole thing towards him, and as she did so, Joe saw the trembling half smile on her lips, the rattlesnake eyes that pinned him to his seat. Her long, knobbly fingers with their uneven yellow nails were scratching at the tablecloth with sheer excitement. Her whole body was coiled up like a spring. Now eat it up, dear. Joe looked at Mrs. Jinx, but she turned away as if unwilling to meet his eyes. He looked at the cream cheese, slopping about in the bowl with the herring lying there like a dead slug. Suddenly, his mind was made up. He pushed the bowl away. "No, thank you," he said. "I'm not hungry." "What?" Granny gargled. She'd been taken off guard and jerked in her seat as if she'd just sat on a drawing pin. "But—" her mouth opened and shut. "What's the matter? Mrs. Jinks?" This was what Joe had most been afraid of. Whose side would Mrs. Jinks take? And Mrs. Jinks herself seemed unsure. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked. "No," Joe said. "Can't you manage a little bit?" "I'm not feeling well." Well, in that case," Mrs. Jinks turned apologetically to Granny. "If he's not well," she began. Granny's face shimmered. Was like looking at a reflection in the sea. One moment there was a look of absolute rage and hatred, the sort of look soldiers must see before they were bayoneted by the enemy. But then, with a huge effort, Granny managed to wipe it away, replacing it with a look of hurtful sadness. Huge crocodile tears welled up in her eyes. Her lips drew back and puckered up like a healing wound. "But darling," she said, "I spent the whole morning getting it ready. It's your favourite." "No, it's not," said Joe. "I don't like it." "But you've always liked it. Have you been eating chocolates and crisps? Have you spoilt your appetite? Is that it, Mrs. Jinks?" What was happening at the table was completely unheard of. It was like that moment in Oliver Twist when Oliver asked for more, only in reverse, and Joe was asking for less. And normally all hell would have broken loose. But Mrs. Jinks had seen the look on Granny's face, the full force of her hatred. Like Joe, she had glimpsed behind the mask, and now she was taking Joe's side. "Joe's not hungry," she said. "Have a drink," Granny trilled. "I've got some hot ribena in the kitchen." "No, thank you." Joe only liked ribena cold. For some reason, once it was heated up, it went all sweet and sticky. "How about a nice lemon and honey milkshake?" "No," Joe insisted. "I could sprinkle nutmeg on top." "No, thank you." "I think I'll take Joe home," Mrs. Jinks said. She wasn't as clever as Granny at hiding her emotions. It was obvious that she wanted to get away. Granny saw it too. Slowly, the anger crept back into her cheeks. Her little eyes widened, and there was a soft yellow glow in what should have been their whites. "This is your fault, Mrs. Jinks," she hissed. "Mine?" Mrs. Jinks was indignant. "You're not bringing the boy up properly, filling him up with sweets and biscuits." "I did no such thing, Mrs. Kettle." "Then why won't he eat? Why won't he eat?" Granny gesticulated with a trembling fist. The edge of her wrist caught one of the bowls of cream cheese, and it flew off the table, landing with a loud plop in her lap. "Now look what you've made me do." She got up and took 2 steps back from the table. It was a mistake. She had forgotten the cactus. "Ah!" Granny leapt 3 feet in the air as she came into contact with the spikes, then collapsed in a heap on the floor. Her dress was covered in cream cheese. Her face was quite purple with anger. Joe had never seen anything like it. It was wonderful and terrifying at the same time. What was Granny going to do? Was she going to mutter the magic words that would turn Mrs. Jinks into a spotted toad? Or more likely, was she merely going to succumb to a massive heart attack? In the end, she did neither. She got to her feet, took a deep breath, and shriveled back into an old, defeated woman. "All right," she muttered with a sigh. "Take him home. Leave me here on my own. I don't mind. I'll just sit by myself and maybe do some knitting." Granny had never knitted anything in her life, except maybe her brow. And so they left. Mrs. Jinks hurried Joe out of the flat and into the lift, although of course that meant the two of them had to spend another 10 minutes standing in awkward silence before they reached the ground. Mrs. Jinks was flushed and looked worried, and she had every reason to be. After they had gone, Granny went to the drinks cabinet and grabbed a bottle of brandy. She pulled the cork out with her teeth, although she very nearly pulled her teeth out with the cork, and took a large swig. Then, feeling better, she went over to the telephone and dialed a number. The phone rang many times before it answered. "Hello?" came a thin, quavering voice from the other end. "Is that Mrs. Bucket?" "Yes, this is Elsie Bucket. This is Ivy Kettle speaking." "Yes, Ivy dear, how very nice to hear from you." But the voice at the other end sounded faintly bored. "Listen," Granny spat the word into the receiver. "I've just had the boy here in my flat. My grandson." "Jeremy?" Now the voice was a little more interested. "His name's John. Now listen, Mrs. Bucket. I've been thinking about Bideford, and I've decided I'm going to bring him along for you." "How delightful of you, my dear Ivy," the voice dripping with icy charm. "There's just one problem," Granny went on. "What problem, Ivy?" "He's got a nanny, a wretched, spiteful nanny. I think she may get in our way." "Then you'll have to deal with her, my dear. Or do you need help?" "I don't need help, thank you, Mrs. Bucket." Granny scowled and chewed air. A lump of cream cheese slithered off her dress and dripped onto her shoes. "I'll deal with Mrs. Jinks," she said at last, "and then the boy will be yours." It's a cliffhanger, isn't it? What does Granny mean? The boy will be yours. What's going to happen? If you know, don't tell anyone. Right, so now I want you please to write your diary entry. Imagine that you are Joe and you've just had to suffer this awful, awful tea, especially knowing now that Granny is not who she really seems. She's not the kind old Granny she's made out. So enjoy writing your diary entry, and I can't wait to see them later. Well done. Bye.
Bye.